thank you very much for joining us today. This is our 5th episode for the day. I'm really delighted to have two absolutely fantastic experts on board. So we've got Dr. Glenda Rivoallan, who I've known now for over a year. We just have the best conversations. We have the same thoughts and feelings on everything, and really excited. She's from We Talk Wellbeing, which is an absolutely fantastic company that helps people deliver and be better at everything that they do, and just puts heart and soul of well-being right at the centre of the conversation. And she's also the Wellonomics resilience expert, so we're very fortunate to be able to work with her. And also Peter Dorrington, who is from Anthrolytics. He's a SaaS founder and an exceptional human behaviourist, and has just got the absolute utmost brilliant stories all about how using data to understand how people feel, behave, how you can influence that in a positive way, not in a negative way, but how you can actually help data and people in this new world that we live in today just to come together and just to be better. So thank you very much for joining us. We'll get going. Peter, if you could start and give us a quick, brief introduction into all the good things that you've done in your lifetime so far and all the good things that you're aiming to do in the future, that would be fantastic. Over to you.
Right. Thank you very much, Glen. So, as Glen said, my name is Peter, and I'm the Chief Strategy Officer and co-founder of Anthrolytics. I'm also the inventor of predictive behavioral analytics, and I'll get into that very briefly. But I've got, I'm going to say, the last 20 years working exclusively with data, so advising organizations on how to use data. But the last 8 years of those, I've been combining it with behavioral science, so data science and behavioral science, in an effort to teach computers about the weird and wonderful things that drive people to do the things that they do. And what I was particularly interested at the time, what started me on that journey, was trying to work out why doesn't traditional predictive analytical techniques do a better job of predicting what people are going to do next. And the conclusion that I came to was it was a lot about emotions and empathy, and the way that people feel has a really significant role in driving the behaviors. So I sat down to answer that question, managed to do so, and we'll talk a little bit about the relevance of that in a moment. But I think the research backs me up on this, or rather I back up the research. Emotions and feelings have huge influence on people's productivity, their mindset, the culture of an organization, and how they interact with other people. And hopefully today we'll get a chance to dive into that in a little bit. But back to you, Glen.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Peter. That is fantastic and really fascinating. Looking forward to the conversation. Glenda, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
It's a real pleasure to be with you guys. Nice to see you again, Glen.
And
nice
yourself?
to meet you again, Peter. Actually, very fascinating to hear your introduction, because I specialise in the area of resilience, which actually, when we break that down nice and simply, we help people to think, feel and behave in a way that's healthy for them. And I think it was really fascinating there that you talked about the importance of emotion and feeling, because I'm sure that this will resonate with you, Glen, but in the 28 years that I've worked in the wellbeing industry, how you feel about things is so critically important to how you then either engage or disengage with a healthy habit. So it's going to be a fascinating conversation, and one that I'm privileged to have with you guys today.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much both for your excellent introductions, and as I'm sure you are feeling the same, I just want to get on with the conversation. So we will start with a biggie. We'll go straight in, and Peter, if I come to you first on the simple question of what is digital empathy?
Simple question, and I'll try and give you a straightforward answer. So, firstly, what is empathy? Well, empathy is not just about being nice or talking politely to people.
Yeah.
It's the ability to understand and share the feelings of another person. But computers don't have feelings. So digital empathy is the way that we look at giving computers or software the ability to identify emotions in another person, so their feelings, whether that's an employee or a customer, and then take that insight and look at the way in which it drives human behavior. And As a result of that, we can then take an appropriate action. So the action part of empathy is called compassion or effective empathy, and that's where we all want to be able to be. Take the right action at the right time for the right person. But this ability to understand what somebody's feeling, we call cognitive empathy, the ability to detect, identify an emotion and what causes it. And digital empathy is when we do that through digital channels. So we can actually teach computers to recognize emotions in other people and recognize the role of those emotions in their behavior, the things we can typically observe, and do that over digital channels. So we can teach bots how to do this. Now, for me, the important part here is this is never going to replace people, conversations, person to person, because people are the best people to talk to people.
Yeah.
But in the world we find ourselves in at the moment, this can be quite challenging with things like remote working, huge workforce, staff turnover. Lots of things are actually making that more complex. And although we're not perfect, what we do offer is scalability. So we can talk about that a little while. So it's empathy, the ability to identify an emotion and take an action as a result of that through digital channels.
Brilliant. That's fantastic. Now, I mean, lots of research has come out recently about how, face-to-face communication, because let's face it, that's how you start that empathetic sort of understanding is through communication. Actually, the use of technology, especially in the younger generations, the ones that have grown up on tech and, are slightly removed from the face-to-face world as well, there's more interactions online than there is face-to-face. And it's showing that there's more more problems there, less social, emotional sort of interactions. And actually this generation that's coming through is becoming less empathetic. Do you think that we are in danger of becoming less empathetic with the use of technology, Glenda?
It's a fascinating question. I think what I'd like to say to you generally is that we don't often spend enough time building our self-awareness and our self-knowledge, whether that's in person or digitally, to then understand how your thoughts and feelings drives your behaviour. And I think that that's the kind of work that I do, is raising awareness, because once we raise awareness of how we interact with others, it then absolutely helps us to set some intention for change. And with attention, we get attention, we get a bit of brave honesty, and then we take total responsibility. And I think whether it's in person or digitally, I think with the rise of stress, and we do really acknowledge that we're living in a stress pandemic, that with stress, people don't always think rationally, they think more emotionally. And that's why I think it's really interesting in the work that you do, is that what we try to do is help people to come back and be a bit more rational. And that's a really interesting idea. I'd love to hear Peter's view about whether or not we are not so good digitally.
Well, I think it's there's a number of things in play here. The first of which is we talk about Generation App. So these are people who, unlike me, type with their thumbs rather than their fingers. They live in a world where there is no inherent loyalty and therefore no great incentive to build up empathetic relationships. They just want to transact. I just want to get stuff done, move on to the next thing. But we are living in this, and I like that term, the stress pandemic, where there's a lot of things going on for people. And when we do have these interactions, actually, they're often very highly emotionally charged. I've been trying to sort this out for half an hour. I can't figure it out. Your website doesn't help me. Or I'm an employee and I'm trying to work my way through this process. I don't feel supported. And when we're dealing with those people, absolutely you need empathy to do it. So I think that some of it is that a lot of our lives have become transactional, and therefore we don't feel we need empathy. After all, we recognize a bot doesn't feel anything, so I can't hurt its feelings. But what's left over, the residue of that, is actually demanding more empathy because it is much more emotional.
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, understanding people, understanding self is a huge one, isn't it, Glenda? And, from where we sit within Wellonomics, we talk about, the company having the responsibility to their workforce, because if you're within that ecosystem, that you are all responsible for one another. But it also starts with you being aware that you are responsible for yourself. and you can't be responsible for yourself before you understand yourself, which is one part of it. But then also, from a company point of view, being able to understand everybody is almost an impossible job these days, especially when we've got the mixture of the hybrid work, the remote worker. I mean, it's become harder, I think, to have those conversations and harder to basically understand what the problem is. So in terms of, combining data and logic and all that wonderful stuff that Peter talks about, and then bringing that to support people and the effect that it has on the company's bottom line, I'd say that's fairly important, wouldn't you, Glenda?
Absolutely critical, because there is an acknowledgement that understanding the self, so seeing well-being from the perspective of the individual, is absolutely critical. But what we do know about well-being is that culture will kill strategy for breakfast, right?
Famous quote.
Famous Drucker quote.
Yep.
But it still holds true to this day, maybe even more so. So if the organisation has got toxic policies, practices, and culture, we're never going to have the environment where people can truly thrive. And I think it's more important than ever that we talk about this dual responsibility. There is the responsibility of the organisation to meet the employee, but also a responsibility of the employee to meet the organisation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That is not as easy as it first sounds.
Yeah.
But I would absolutely say that the organisations out there that are, with all best intention, focused on purely self-interventions might be missing the mark. And it's really critical that we look at the macro perspective. And I think that data is absolutely critical to help us do that, for sure.
So, Peter, how do you think then, companies can use data such as KWIs? KWIs, for everybody listening, key wellbeing indicators. It's what we measure through our algorithmic questionnaire. Put my teeth in quickly. Every month, because again, wellbeing is fluid. And data is about trends, isn't it? Recognizing patterns, understanding where there's a problem, and then hopefully seeing a positive change in that data when you put in, as Glenda would say, the correct intervention, whether it's understanding self. We also call that individual employee responsibility. It's a term I nicked from when I was in professional sports, and it's called individual athlete responsibility. Take responsibility for yourself, and if we all do that, but that overarching piece that Glenda's talking about is taking data every month and going, hey, look, this is our, and I hate this term, low-hanging fruit, but generally speaking, what you're saying is this is the problem, this is the data that we're seeing, this is the problem, can we do something about it positively? And all I'd say to you, Peter, is, how can companies use this data to better support people and create sustainable change? Is it something that should be part of the fabric of an organisation now?
Well, I think the answer is quite straightforward in that, yes, absolutely. I mean, we only have to look at the world of work as it exists at the moment. We've got big structural changes going on in where we work, when we work, how we work. Lots of the practices that we adopted over the decades of employment and people like Drucker have really been tested, in some cases, to destruction at the point. But let's look at the crisis going on with staffing right now. We're finding it hard to attract people. Then we need to get them productive and motivated. Most businesses are very focused on the bottom line. And one of the challenges here is that when we're talking about emotions and empathy and resilience, some people find it hard to quantify the impact of that. Now, I call this putting compassion on the bottom line. And it absolutely is measurable. We know that employees who are ready, willing, and able to deliver superior results to those that are either unprepared, don't have the mindset for it, or lack the tools and the capacity to do it. So empathy is not something which is intangible. It definitely does have measurable business results. But I'm going to focus on the mental well-being aspect of this for a moment, because it definitely contributes to physical well-being, but it does deserve its own attention. So if we want people to have a positive mindset, we need to figure out what they're feeling, both positive and negative, how strongly they're feeling that and what causes it, so that we can look at, are there factors that we can adapt or change, some of which are down to the employee themselves, but not every employee is fully able to articulate what they're feeling and why they're feeling it. So what we use data for there is, rather than keep asking everybody all of the time, how do you feel? How do you feel? What are you thinking?
Yeah.
And those of us that remember the start of our relationships can know how annoying that question can be. It certainly was for me all the time. Quite honestly, I don't know. I haven't done enough introspection.
Yeah.
But when people talk about their experiences, what they naturally do is talk about what's important to them. And then, because we're humans talking to other humans, we say why it was important. So really, like this podcast, I've talked about a subject, the podcast, and the fact that I really like it. So we need to identify what I call the moments that matter. Now, that's anything that generates an emotional response. The problem with that is that, firstly, we don't always get that by asking one or two people. We need to actually go to a broad range of people to get different views.
Yeah.
And secondly, they don't always exhibit an immediately observable effect. So we do something, I might irritate you, Glen. And in doing so, you don't actually immediately respond to that. But if I keep doing it, eventually you'll get to the point where you're so irritated that you'll say, that's it, I'm throwing you out of the podcast.
Well, I'm glad I said what I said about us being cut off the podcast before it happened. Because it might have been interpreted the wrong way.
But what we want to do is actually get to the point where we can identify early that people are approaching these points of crisis or these decision points, which is going to drive their behavior. Because if we can do that, and if we can do that without constantly surveying, we can take an early action. Yeah. But of course, what the surveying does, what the asking does, is occasionally make sure we're checking in that we can course correct if we've misunderstood something. So there might be an external factor we're unaware of. So we need both. We need both direct observation through data gathering, and that's not what I do, by the way. I analyze the data. But then we need to be able to take that analysis and make a prediction about where do we think this person's heading. Is it something that is mutually agreeable, or one of us is going to suffer as a result of that? Therefore, what can I do about that before something that might be a minor problem escalates into being a crisis and is unrecoverable?
If I just gave a practical example of the use of data, which I think is fascinating, when we work with people on resilience, for example, in our resilience model, we use a tool that not only measures the person's resilience, but also the impact that it has on their well-being. When we take that baseline measure, we then obviously start an intervention over a period of time. And what's really fantastic about data is when we present that to the employee, it never fails to surprise me the amount of employees that will say, it's like the light bulb moment. I felt all this stuff. It became very overwhelming. But when I see it there, that is me.
Yeah.
That really gives them some form of comfort and validation about what's been going on behind how they're thinking and feeling. And what's really special is when you can then retest using the same tool and show the person the distance travelled. And it can make what is on the surface something that you think is unmeasurable, measurable. Because I'm a great believer, if you don't measure it, you can't manage it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just for everybody listening as well, could you, Glenda, maybe just describe resilience, in the workplace and why it's important? I think most people would think they know, but I think from an expert such as yourself, just to sort of go into a little bit more depth and explanation as to what resilience is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that you would all agree that it's been a buzzword over the last
completely
24 months, and I think you're going to see that for some time to come. I'd also like to say we don't help ourselves because it's quite a complex word to start with.
Yeah.
And like well-being, resilience means different things to different people, but as resilience experts, we fully measure people the same regardless of who you are. What's really fascinating about the definition of resilience, that old-fashioned idea that it was your ability to bounce back from adversity, is a very small part of the story. Resilience doesn't just allow you to bounce back from adversity, it allows you to move forward better than you were before. And for us, resilience is a resilient mindset, it's a resilient skill set, and it's also a resilient tool set. And that's why when we work with people on resilience to help that person cope with life's challenges, life's adversities, but also life's opportunities.
Yeah.
In a way where they can think healthy, they can feel healthy, so therefore they can behave in a way that's healthy. We really do that through developing what I call the resilience backpack. And that's with you for life, because we're building tools. And we see the majority of that in 5 key ways. Might surprise you, but just like the foundations of a house, the foundations of resilience is energy.
Yeah.
Because if you don't come at life and work with the right fuel, well, why are you surprised about what you then get out?
Exactly. A great key
Fuel
well-being
is
indicator.
the foundation of resilience. And we look at numerous aspects there: sleep, physical activity, healthy consumption, to name a couple. We then look at the person's future focus, because we know in the resilience literature that if you don't understand your purpose and your direction, you're going to feel like the hamster on the wheel.
Yeah, disconnected.
We then go deeper into mindset. We look at the person's ability to be flexible in their thinking, their ability to be open-minded and positive. And then what I see as one of the biggest barriers in resilience is, what is the person's self-belief? Because if you don't believe in yourself, it will drain you of your resilience.
Yep.
But I think the most underrated one, but probably the most important in corporate, the last pillar that we look at in our model of resilience is relationships, because we know it to be the biggest drain in resilience in the workplace. Relationships are absolutely critical to your resilience, whether that's your ability to take support and also build trust with people.
Yep.
So I hope that helps you a little, because we really break resilience down into those 5 key pillars. And that's a tool set that we build in people.
Yeah, and I think with that tool set and that ability, I mean, I love your favourite Japanese quote about falling down 7 times and getting up 8. Without those pillars, it's almost impossible, I think. And I think, you know, if there's one thing that I get from that message, and what we hear a lot about, people need people, and it's how you have that human connection, you know, through, you know, new work times and new work practices. And I think data needs to be seen in the right way rather than the wrong way. And data is there to support the human interactions and the human communication, rather than default into, no, we're going to do everything digitally. Because there's one thing that we're not. We are definitely not a digital platform and an app. We are a wellbeing company that collects people data so that people like Peter can analyse it and people like Glenda can fix it.
Well, what I love about the work that Peter does is we absolutely have to accept that we don't think rationally all of the time. What drives people's behaviour is more often than not driven by emotion and not rationality. And at the risk of doing you out of a job, Peter, which I cannot claim to be that incredible, we aim to try and get people to understand their emotions and understand how to evaluate when their emotions are helpful to them and when they're not. And when they're not, how we get to reframe in a way that rationality then becomes more prominent.
And how do you see that sort of personal development work benefiting individuals and companies, Glenda?
Well, it's like I said before, I feel what we tend to do is we behave in ways, even at work, that are often very reactive. And if we can help people create space between their thoughts and their actions, we are more likely to get people to understand the impact of their behaviour and, most importantly, stop it from happening.
Yeah.
Because they're able to create that space for thought and understanding the potential impact. You only have to see that when we talk about the flame email. How many people will send an email and within a very quick period of time wish they could recall it?
Oh, everybody's been there. Everybody's tried to find the callback button, which I don't think exists anymore. But anyway, you know, it's
and that's because we were wired in a way that was developed, our brains were wired for pre-medieval times, not wired for the fast-paced environment that we're in today. And it's very, very quick how someone can go into fight or flight and threat mode and therefore behave in a way that they would not ordinarily behave. Yeah. So what we specialise is in reducing how quickly you'll go into fight or flight, because if we're stressed, we're already in there.
Yeah. And having this understanding, Peter, I mean, obviously it's going to affect data, isn't it? If we're recording how people feel and stuff. And as you know, at Wellonomics, we believe, physical well-being drives better, mental well-being drives better, work well-being. And the things that we kind of, collect data on are KWIs: appreciation, contribution, balance, mood, anxiety, stress, sleep, energy. As Glenda said right at the very beginning, we're a massive believer in energy. How do you, better prepared people and more integrated workspaces, how do you see that affecting those kind of analytics?
I think Glenda's really touched on some very interesting points, because she's absolutely right that resilience isn't just about the ability to take it on the chin when things get difficult. It's about giving people tools to deal with the world as it is, not as they would like it to be, in the same way that they also have to have enough agility to be able to respond. I think that one of the things that we focused on was, as Glen said, not being reactive, trying to help people identify, well, what is it that's going on in my workplace? And I'll take a different example. I was of the generation, we were taught management by walking around and building human relationships and establishing rapport and identifying when somebody might be at a point where they need an intervention, or if their energy level was dipping. That's often quite difficult to discuss with an organisation which is very focused on operational measures. So they're more interested in output, KPIs, process.
Yep.
So, exactly. So the KPIs, they can have unintended consequences. So we use them to drive a behaviour that we as an organisation want. But that can often lead to things like tunnel vision. So people just focus on the things they're directly measured at. Or people can be so, the term stress, they're so stressed, they're not actually reflecting or taking that time to think about, is there a better way to do this? Am I actually doing the right kinds of things? So it can sneak up on you. And so indicators that are both predictive and also direct measurements can help us understand, is somebody's mindset in a place which is not helpful to them or us? Because at the end of the day, organizations often talk about people as being their best asset or their most valuable asset, and they treat them like they're forklift trucks. They're just another machine for getting something done. And we don't always take the time to recognize that they're humans. And what do humans value? The reason we have language is we value sharing our outlook, that empathy and rapport, being able to ask for advice, being able to say, okay, I'm feeling pretty great right now, and here's why, or, maybe I'm not in a good place. And for some organizations, it's definitely not okay to say that you're not okay. And that's a culture thing. And we're going to have to address culture if we're going to go there. Not just in this area, by the way, but in things like, how do we treat failure in an environment where there's a lot of unknowns, which many of us find ourselves in.
And culture.
So the measures that we use.
Sorry, I was just going to say, just picking up on the culture bit that you put in there. I mean, culture is generally failing. That's where we feel that things are getting affected at the moment. But who takes responsibility for culture in an organisation? I mean, as you know, it all tends to sort of stem back to HR. But is it their responsibility? Where does culture get driven from, Glenda?
Right from the very top. And it's quite important, because even when we look at resilience, when I said about the resilient mindset, the resilient skill set falls in leadership. And it's really important that in leadership, we see role modelling of the right behaviours that are going to drive the right culture. And it also comes down to how we coach individuals to self-perpetuate the culture that we're all trying to work towards. It's not something that can be given to a department. It's the entire organisation learning from seeing their leaders role model the type of behaviour that's going to drive a performance culture rather than the type of culture that Peter talks about, which sounds like a blame culture or a fear culture. Culture is so inherently difficult, but it absolutely has to start from the top. And I think when it comes to well-being right now, we don't see leaders always looking after their own well-being.
Correct.
If you are trying to fill from an empty cup, what does that signal to your employees?
Yeah, and we're currently reporting, I think March the stats came back for our KWI for balance, which is obviously one of our work wellbeing KWIs, that 36% of workers currently do not feel like they have good balance. And like you say, if that kind of messaging is being perpetuated from leadership where, you know, it's this work at all costs, you know, ignore your own health and well-being, etc., 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 then, like as you say, that's not going to come down and be part of the DNA of any kind of, you know, organizational environment. So it's not really what we should be perpetuating. And I think that stems back to the whole thing about looking after yourself first, but then also trying to get the leadership team to sit down and actually start with them. And last week we launched Snapshot, which was a very interesting product that is a kind of like a Wellonomics light. But we're finding that the results that are coming back from that, which are very, very quick, because a lot of people don't want to take the time sometimes. I think they just kind of feel like, you know, oh, well-being, I'll deal with that later. You know, you always think about your health later, don't you? But that's the health of the organisation. So to actually sit and discuss that around a boardroom table first and foremost, and to get everybody there signed up to what it is that you're going to do, you'd probably say that that is a top-down company approach, but you've got to involve all the right people and have the right conversation. Surely not.
The most resilient group are leaders, which gives us a double-edged sword, because that's really great that they're resilient enough to be a leader. But sadly, many leaders, because they themselves are resilient, they don't understand what it's like to not be.
Yeah, I think we can all think of one great example of that right now, somebody who's taken over a large tech company and the way that they're setting the tempo for that.
Was he on the BBC? Last week?
I think Peter's example is beautiful because there's and it comes back to Peter's comment about empathy, is many leaders with best intentions think that everyone else is like them for their energy, for their future focus, for their self-belief. And sadly, what we see is that leaders are the most resilient group. But that doesn't always translate into them understanding people who are not.
Absolutely. If you're a leader...
Go on, Peter.
I was going to say, if you're a leader that can get by on 4 hours sleep a night by drinking loads of energy drinks, and you're really enthused about, you know, a technology or a particular approach, as you say, and if you're not empathetic, it's very easy, in fact, by diktat, to say everybody has to behave like me. The reality in modern work is that actually demands on employees have grown dramatically, particularly because we've used automation to take away all of those low-skill, low-value tasks. And what's left over, by definition, is unique, complex, often very emotional. And there can be a mindset with that kind of leadership, which is, well, we just burn them and churn them. And as we saw from that leader, his example was, you've got to be prepared to work 80 hours a week, and if you're not, there's the door. And quite a lot of them voted with their feet and said, well, that's not what I signed up to do, because although you might live to work, I work to live.
Yeah.
And I think, Glenda, your point, balance is key here. We need to form an equitable balance where both parties is getting something of value out of that relationship. The challenge I had with, well, I know why it's been given to HR, because all things people tend to end up at HR.
Yeah, exactly.
So we say, well, it's their role, but actually it's everybody's role within an organisation. We build our culture together, and although it comes from the top in terms of a guiding staff or mission and purpose, we just can't keep fostering it off and saying, well, it's HR's problem, let HR fix it. It's all of our problem, and we need the tools to be able to be equipped to deal with that, as in a much more challenging environment than 50, 60, 70 years ago.
I don't know if you guys have looked at the latest Gallup State of the Global Workforce Report 2022?
Funnily enough, I was just going to talk
I'm
about that.
going to
But
now.
yeah,
Well, super fascinating though, right? Because it really shows us the scale of the problem and detachment from work and lack of engagement. And what was really fascinating is they statistically showed that 23% of people are thriving at work. But what I found more fascinating is that they could apportion responsibility to leadership in 70% of all cases.
yeah,
And I do think that we have to consider that who taught us to now lead in the world that we find ourselves in now? Because I know when I was taught leadership, it was for a world that was pre-pandemic. Everything has changed. You said it, Peter, about the hybrid world, the post-pandemic world. There is definitely the need for upskilling. And I want to pick on Peter's point. Leaders are going to have to bring more compassion and empathy to the job. Leaders are going to have to be trained to have well-being conversations.
absolutely. And
because this stuff is not going away.
no.
We have never seen higher levels of anxiety, higher levels of poor mental health. And what that report found is that 3 of the big things that are having this impact, we can do something about. Excessive workload, which you talked about, Peter, lack of communication, and unfair treatment. And I'd love to pick on the last one because I want to challenge people. I do like work-life balance, but I prefer work-life flourishing because you might not be flourishing working only 20 hours a week. You could be flourishing working 70. So as much as work-life balance is helpful, I don't think we should get over-obsessed about the number of hours we work.
No.
Yes, we understand that the increase in hours can, over the long term, make you more predisposed to things like heart disease. I get that. But in the grand scheme of things, we've got to get deeper and understand our employees at a much deeper level, because you could be sitting with an employee right now who is part-time and completely only surviving.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think, Glenda, I mean, there's been some recent research. I had cause to look it up recently when I was writing about the number of working days lost to poor mental health.
Yeah, it's massive.
And it's something, I think, if I recall correctly, over 150 million working days in the UK are lost through poor mental health. That's having a national impact. That's not just for a single organisation. So at the individual level, it's clearly a tragedy for the people involved, but it rolls all the way up to the way that we work. And I think that, you know, my belief, and I'm probably going to get shot down for this, is that too many businesses are measuring their performance using KPIs and measures that were developed at the end of the 1800s. And we've taught that in management school, and we're saying, break your businesses into silos, give people KPIs that are easy to measure so that you can drive their performance. And they have not adapted at all for a change in the world in which we live. And so we do need things like the KWI, because these are important measures for the world in which we live today, the experience economy, rather than the production industrial economy, which is still there. And don't get me wrong, it's not important that we don't measure productivity, but it's not the number of hours worked or the number of widgets you crank out. And the other thing I think is interesting, and it may be an aphorism, is the statistic that's often quoted that 60% of CEOs are sociopaths. So they have no ability to empathize. And what they're rewarded on are those very simple measures which are easy to quantify and go back to the market and say, look at what a great job I've done. Productivity is up at 15%. But staff turnover has absolutely collapsed in terms of people aren't loyal anymore. And I mentioned earlier, ready, willing, and able, if any one of those isn't present, performance just isn't going to meet what you require as an individual or as a business.
And that's a win at all costs.
Glen, sorry,
so I was just going to say, that's just a win at all cost mentality, which just doesn't doesn't work. And to go back to, I mean, the report you
Well, it
talked
goes
about.
with competition, right? The clue's in the name, competition.
Yeah, but you've got to look at the fact that, I mean, Glenda, bringing up the Gallup report is something that I was going to start to touch on. You picked out some of the stats that I had to talk about, which is just, which is brilliant. But the fact of the matter is that if we don't support leaders in their own education, because again, most managers become managers because you've been there a long time, and again, I think with everything that's gone over the last few years, there's been so much survivalist mentality and change mentality of let's just get on with it, let's just do it, things are different. But actually supporting leaders, and that Gallup report also said that 73% of senior leaders don't feel like they have been supported or trained to be able to, develop or deliver their own employee recognition skill set, because they're just not, no one's ever thought about it that way. And what we've seen from a KWI point of view, from appreciation, is that only 86% of people feel appreciated, which actually, if I'm being totally honest, that's quite high, I think, at this moment in time, based on what we've seen recently with Snapshot. But the effect of people not feeling appreciated can actually have, in 1 in 6, a 28% increase in productivity and a 31% reduction in absenteeism. So when you relate a KWI to a KPI, you're still doing KPIs.
Absolutely.
But KWIs surely are the foundation of that.
Well, the simple reality is feeling appreciated is one of the top 3 things that gives people happiness at work.
Yeah.
Feeling appreciated, that you're valued, feeling that you make a difference, and feeling that you have autonomy in your work. So the next person who would say to me, oh, we're not going to measure happiness, that's fluffy.
Yeah.
The challenge we have is people say these things from a position of ignorance. It's our job as wellbeing experts to educate people in what we actually do, and we have to take responsibility for that. We've got to do a better job at explaining to people what we measure when we measure wellbeing. There is still too many organisations and practitioners out there who don't measure what they're trying to manage. And I think it's critically important that if organisations are going to work with any reputable wellbeing company, they must be looking at data. They must be understanding what you're measuring. And, when you actually break down key wellbeing measures, they are anything but fluffy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, to be honest,
I have to agree.
Yeah, Peter, over to you.
I was going to say, my life, as I say, is driven by data.
Yeah.
If you're into psychological profiles, then I'm all about the data. Bring me your data, not your emotions, because I frankly don't understand emotions, which may seem weird in my role. But one of the things that's absolutely important. The other thing is, I think there's a couple of things that struck me about this. That there's a danger of some people thinking that resilient means that, if they're more resilient, we can give them more work.
Absolutely.
That's clearly not the point.
Yeah.
You completely miss if that's what you're going on. The second of which is, I think many people, we talk about well-being and many leaders talk about it, but they're not coming across as being authentic. So they're talking about, they're exhibiting a completely different behavior from what they're actually talking about. And all of us tend to look upwards for guidance as to where is my purpose and mission. That's set from leadership. But as I say, it isn't just the CEO's job. It comes all the way down through all of the management layers, down to individual responsibility. And we have to be aligned on this. We have to all agree this is what we think is important. And you can absolutely destroy that within a team by only celebrating the leader or only celebrating one particular performer, when many of us are actually just doing the grind day in, day out and not feeling appreciated. Now, I saw that as a behavioural group, an empathic segment I called the overlooked and neglected. Yeah. And these are people who aren't actually having bad things done to them, but they never get recognition. They never have the good things that go with the role. They're just quietly getting on with the job. So I think you need authenticity about this. I think too many organisations are now trying to jump on the bandwagon without doing the work and expecting to get the results. So if you're going to talk it, walk it, I think is quite straightforward. And as we talked about, measure the right things. Use data to guide your decisions, not your instinct, because your instinct may take you down a complete alley in terms of where you need to go.
Glenda?
You're absolutely right. I was just going to mention that the work that you do, Peter, data-driven insights will save you money. because we see so many companies out there working in the implementing well-being strategy, but without the strategy actually, and without understanding what worked and what didn't work. And if you start with data and measure with data, you will make your well-being budget go so much further than if you don't use data-driven insight.
100%. And I think the term for that at the moment is well-being whitewashing, which is where people talk the talk but don't deliver. I think this is an absolutely fantastic place to end and conclude on the fact that you need to start by understanding first and foremost. That's where the data picture comes in. As you just said a minute ago, Peter, it's not something that you trust your gut on. If you understand something, if you truly understand, then you create that awareness. And then, as Glenda would say, it's that positive action that actually makes that change and that difference. And I think, not taking well-being seriously will massively impact and affect your KPIs. And if we can have that and create that conversation where we understand the importance of well-being, which in its own right should be its own KPI, but what makes up well-being is huge. And you've got to set people up with the understanding, the awareness and the action, but you've also got to set people up with the tools. You've got to set people up with the education, the management training. Stuff has changed, which is basically what I'm concluding from this amazing chat today. As is always the case, these chats just get going when I have to press the stop button. Otherwise, I get told off for going on too long. But I do think this is a two-parter as well. I think we should come back. We should talk about this again. Maybe discuss the data. Maybe discuss some of the programs that we've been working on within organisations to show how that changes. Because I think once the evidence is there and the conversation is greater, people will actually adopt this as not a nice to have, but an essential. So thank you so much today, Peter Dorrington and Glenda Rivoallan, for your excellent conversation as always. And I will absolutely be having you guys back on again within the next few months so we can actually discuss all the great work that is happening. Thank you very much. Have a great day.